The first light of dawn crept across the Montana plains when Cassian Rourke stepped into his barn and found something that would change everything. There, curled against a bale of hay beside her exhausted mare, lay a woman battered, broken, but breathing. Most folks in Copper Ridge knew Cass as the richest rancher in 3 counties, a man who kept to himself and his business dealings. He was respected, feared even, but never considered compassionate. What happened next would shake the foundations of everything the town thought they knew about the man they called untouchable. Instead of calling the sheriff or turning away from trouble, Cass made a decision that defied every expectation. He carried the stranger into his home, nursed her back to health, and gave her sanctuary when the whole world seemed against her. But what drove a man of his standing to protect a fugitive? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The silver pocket watch in Cassian Rourke's vest had belonged to his father, and his father's father before that. 3 generations of Rourke men had carried it, each one building upon the legacy of the last. Now at 47, Cass pulled it from his pocket with the same ritualistic precision he'd practiced for 23 years, ever since the day he'd inherited not just the timepiece, but the weight of expectations that came with the Rourke name. 5:30 in the morning. The numbers glowed softly in the pre-dawn darkness of his study, where he'd been reviewing livestock reports and quarterly projections. The Rourke Ranch sprawled across 12,000 acres of the finest grazing land in Copper Ridge County, supporting nearly 3,000 head of cattle and 200 horses. What had started as his great-grandfather's modest homestead had grown into an empire worth more than most small towns could claim in their entirety. But empires, Cass had learned, could be lonely places to rule. He closed the ledger with deliberate care, the leather cover worn smooth by decades of handling. Everything in his life had this quality, well-maintained, purposeful, enduring. The massive oak desk had been his father's. The Persian rug beneath his feet had been his mother's choice. Even the crystal whiskey decanter, though he rarely touched it anymore, had been positioned exactly where his father had kept it. The house itself stood as a testament to Rourke prosperity. Built in 1889 by his great-grandfather, the Victorian mansion had weathered Montana's harsh seasons with stubborn grace. 3 stories of hand-hewn timber and native stone, with wraparound porches that offered views of the crazy mountains to the north and the endless grasslands rolling south toward the Yellowstone River. Inside, 12 rooms filled with furniture that had been chosen for durability rather than comfort. Artwork that spoke of travels his ancestors had taken to places Cass had never seen. He'd been born in the master bedroom upstairs, delivered by the same doctor who'd attended his father's birth. He'd taken his first steps on these polished hardwood floors, learned to read in the library that still smelled of leather and pipe tobacco, even though no one had smoked in the house for 15 years. Every room held memories, but they were memories of duty, of expectation, of a life lived in service to something larger than himself. The irony wasn't lost on him that he'd achieved everything his father had dreamed of and more, yet felt emptier than when he'd started. Cass rose from his chair, a motion that had become automatic over the years. His body had grown lean and hard from decades of ranch work, though these days he spent more time in boardrooms than on horseback. Still, the work had marked him: calloused hands, sun-weathered skin, shoulders that carried the weight of responsibility with practiced ease. His dark hair, now touched with silver at the temples, was always neatly trimmed. His clothes, even for ranch work, were well-tailored and expensive. Image mattered in his world, and Cassian Rourke had long ago learned to wear his success like armor. The walk to the barn took him past the kitchen windows, where Mrs. Henley would arrive in another hour to prepare his breakfast. She'd been his housekeeper for 12 years, ever since his mother had passed. A kind woman, efficient and unobtrusive, who understood that her employer preferred his solitude. She would lay out his meal, tend to the house, and disappear into the background of his life, like a ghost who kept everything running smoothly. The barn itself was a cathedral of wood and shadow, built to house 40 horses in comfort that would make some humans envious. Cass had spared no expense on the structure-soaring cathedral ceilings. Stalls crafted from imported hardwoods, a ventilation system that kept the air fresh even in the depths of winter. His horses weren't just livestock. They were his passion, the one area of his life where business calculations gave way to something approaching love. He'd been breeding quarter horses for 15 years, developing a bloodline that had gained national recognition. Champions bore the Rourke brand, and their offspring commanded prices that would make other ranchers whistle in amazement. But the money wasn't the point, not really. In the quiet moments when he worked with the horses, when their powerful bodies responded to his touch with trust and respect, Cass felt something he rarely experienced elsewhere, a connection that needed no words, demanded no performance. The morning routine was sacred. Check each stall, ensure fresh water, inspect for any signs of illness or injury. The horses knew his schedule, nickering softly as he passed, their breath visible in the cold air. Outside, the sky was beginning to lighten, that deep purple that preceded true dawn. In another hour, his ranch hands would arrive, and the day's work would begin in earnest. For now, the world belonged to him and his horses, which was why the sight that greeted him stopped him cold. The woman lay curled in the far corner of the barn, her dark hair matted with blood and dirt, her clothes torn and stained with something that might have been mud or worse. She was breathing. He could see the slight rise and fall of her chest, but everything about her posture spoke of exhaustion so complete it bordered on collapse. Beside her, a mare stood with her head lowered, reins trailing in the straw. The horse was as worn as her rider, ribs showing through a coat that had once been chestnut but now appeared nearly black with sweat and grime. Cass had seen his share of desperation over the years. Ranch life attracted drifters, people running from one thing or another. But this was different. This spoke of something deeper than mere hardship. This was the kind of defeat that came from having run as far and as hard as possible, only to find that you'd run out of options, out of road, out of hope. He approached slowly, his boots silent on the straw-covered floor. The mare lifted her head at his approach, but didn't flee. Her eyes were intelligent, wary but not wild. A good horse, he could tell, even in her current condition. Well-trained, well-loved. The kind of horse that spoke of an owner who understood the bond between human and animal. The woman stirred as he drew closer, but didn't wake. In the growing light, he could see that she was younger than he'd first thought, perhaps 30, 35 at most. Her face, despite the bruising and dirt, held the kind of beauty that came from strength rather than delicacy. High cheekbones, a determined jaw, hands that bore the calluses of someone who worked for her living, but it was the marks on her arms, the careful way she held herself even in unconsciousness, that told the real story. Cass had seen enough in his 47 years to recognize the signs of violence, the way a body learned to protect itself even in sleep. The smart thing would be to call Sheriff Patterson. Let the law handle whatever situation this woman had brought to his doorstep. He owed her nothing, had no obligation to get involved in troubles that weren't his own. The Rourke name had been built on smart decisions, calculated risks, and the wisdom to know when to step back from complications. But as he stood there in the gathering dawn, watching this stranger sleep in his barn beside her faithful horse, Cassian Rourke found himself thinking not of smart decisions or calculated risks, but of something his mother had told him years ago, when he was still young enough to believe that life was simple. "Sometimes, Cass," she'd said, "the most important thing you can do is just be kind." He'd forgotten that lesson somewhere along the way, buried it beneath layers of business strategy and social expectation. But looking at this woman now, seeing the way her fingers still clutched the mare's reins even in sleep, He felt something stir in his chest that he hadn't felt in years. Without really making a conscious decision, he found himself walking toward his house, his mind already working through the practicalities. Mrs. Henley wouldn't arrive for another hour. He could move the woman to the guest room, tend to her injuries, let her recover in private. The horse could stay in the barn, be properly cared for. Whatever she was running from, whatever had brought her to his door, it could wait until she was strong enough to face it. The silver pocket watch ticked steadily in his vest, marking the seconds of a decision that would change everything. But for the first time in years, Cassian Rourke wasn't thinking about time or schedules or the weight of expectations. He was thinking about what it meant to be human in a world that too often demanded otherwise. The woman slept on, unaware that her life was about to intersect with that of a man who had forgotten how to trust, forgotten how to hope, forgotten how to believe that sometimes the most extraordinary things could grow from the simplest acts of kindness. In the distance, the first light of true dawn touched the peaks of the crazy mountains, and the world began to wake. The woman's eyes opened like a startled doe's, wide, unfocused, and filled with the kind of terror that came from waking in an unfamiliar place when the last thing you remembered was running for your life. June Harper's first instinct was to flee, her body jerking upright on the guest room bed, despite the sharp protest from her ribs and the throbbing in her skull. "Easy now," Cass said from the chair beside the window, his voice deliberately calm and measured. "You're safe. You're at the Rourke Ranch, about 15 miles outside Copper Ridge." She turned toward his voice, her hand instinctively reaching for something that wasn't there, a gesture that told him she'd grown accustomed to defending herself. Her fingers found only the soft cotton of a clean nightgown, and confusion flickered across her face. "My clothes," Mrs. Henley cleaned them. "She's my housekeeper, very discreet." He gestured toward the dresser, where her garments lay folded and mended. "Your horse is in the barn, fed and watered. She's a fine mare, Buttercup." The name came out as barely a whisper, and he saw her shoulders relax slightly. Whatever else she'd lost, wherever she'd come from, that horse represented something precious to her. "She's safe," he assured her. "Doc Morrison, he's the veterinarian, looked her over yesterday. Exhausted and underfed, but nothing that good care won't fix." "Yesterday?" She sat up straighter, wincing at the movement. "How long have I been?" 3 days. He watched her process this information, saw the way her fingers moved to her left hand, where a simple gold wedding band caught the afternoon light. The ring was worn thin, but she wore it like a shield, twisting it nervously as she spoke. "I need to go," she said, swinging her legs over the side of the bed. The movement was careful, practiced, as if she'd learned to move despite pain. "I can't stay here." "You don't understand. Then help me understand." The words hung in the air between them. She studied his face, searching for something judgment, perhaps, or the kind of calculating interest that had learned to recognize in men. Instead, she found only patience and a kindness that seemed to catch her off guard. "You should have called the sheriff," she said finally. "Should have done a lot of things." He leaned back in his chair, making himself less imposing. "But I've found that should have doesn't always lead to the right choice." June Harper was 32 years old, though the last few years had aged her in ways that didn't show in mirrors. She'd learned to read people quickly, to assess threats and opportunities in the space of a heartbeat. This man, this wealthy rancher who'd found her in his barn and brought her into his home, was a puzzle she couldn't quite solve. "My name is June," she said, offering the only truth she felt safe sharing. "Cass Rourke." He nodded toward the window. "This is my land, my home. Has been for 23 years. She followed his gaze to the rolling hills beyond, where cattle grazed in the distance, and the mountains rose like ancient guardians against the sky. It was beautiful, in a way that made her chest ache, the kind of beauty she'd forgotten existed, in a world that had shown her mostly ugliness. "I was married," she said suddenly, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. 3 years ago, I thought I was the luckiest woman alive. Marcus Harper was everything I thought I wanted: handsome, successful, charming. He owned a lumber mill in Wyoming, had a big house, a reputation as a good man. Her fingers twisted. The wedding ring again, the metal warm from her skin. He wasn't good. The words came out flat, emotionless, as if she'd practiced stripping the feeling from them. The first time he hit me, he cried afterward, begged my forgiveness brought, and flowers, promised it would never happen again. I believed him because I wanted to believe him. Cass remained silent, understanding that some stories needed to be told without interruption. It got worse. Not just the hitting that almost would have been easier to understand. He was clever about it, psychological. Made me doubt myself, isolated me from friends, made me believe I was crazy, worthless. By the time I realized what was happening, I was trapped. He controlled everything, the money, the house, even my horse. She looked toward the window again, as if seeking Buttercup's presence for comfort. 3 weeks ago, I found out about the land. Marcus had been using forged documents to claim mineral rights on property that wasn't his. Thousands of acres, millions of dollars. When I confronted him about it, she touched her ribs gingerly, the bruises there still tender. He said he'd kill me before he'd let me ruin him. I believed him. So you ran. I took Buttercup and what little cash I could find, and I ran. But Marcus has connections, people who work for him. They've been tracking me across 3 states. Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. They found me 2 days ago in Billings. I barely got away. The weight of her story settled between them like a stone. Cass had dealt with violent men before. Montana had its share of rough characters. But there was something about the quiet way she told her story that made it more chilling than any dramatic tale might have been. The land he was claiming, he said carefully. Where was it? She reached for her saddlebags, which someone had placed on the chair beside the bed. With trembling fingers, she withdrew a folded packet of papers, their edges worn from handling. I grabbed these when I ran. I thought maybe I could use them to, I don't know, prove what he was doing maybe. Get help from the law. Cass took the papers, his hands steady despite the growing tension in his chest. As he unfolded them, he recognized the county surveyor's seal, the legal language that described property, boundaries, and mineral rights. And there, in black and white, was his own land, 12,000 acres of the Rourke Ranch, claimed under Marcus Harper's name through documents that bore dates from before Cass's family had ever owned the property. Forgery was sophisticated, professional. Someone had invested serious time and money into creating these papers. But they were fake. Cass knew every inch of his land, every legal document pertaining to its ownership. His family's claim went back 4 generations, documented and recorded. In the county courthouse. He was trying to steal your ranch, June said, reading his expression. That's what the papers show, isn't it? Among other things. He folded the documents carefully, his mind already working through the implications. This explains why his people have been so persistent in tracking you down. These papers are worth a fortune, but they're also evidence of fraud on a massive scale. The realization hit them both at the same time. She wasn't just a battered wife running from an abusive husband. She was carrying evidence that could destroy a criminal enterprise, and the people hunting her wouldn't stop until they had those documents back or until she was dead. I have to leave, she said again, but there was no conviction in her voice. Now, she knew as well as he did that running wouldn't solve anything. Sooner or later, they would find her. Where would you go? He asked gently. How far can you run on an exhausted horse with no money and half the western states looking for you? She had no answer because there was no good answer. She'd reached the end of her rope the moment she'd collapsed in his barn, and they both knew it. There's another option, Cass said, his voice carrying the weight of a decision that would change both their lives. You could stay. Let me help you fight this. You don't understand what you're offering. Marcus has money, influence, dangerous people working for him. If you help me, he'll become a target too. I've been a target before. His voice carried a quiet steel that made her look at him more carefully. And I have resources of my own. Maybe it's time someone stood up to your husband and his associates. Why? The question came out raw, vulnerable. Why would you risk everything for a stranger? Cass was quiet for a long moment, thinking of the silver pocket watch in his vest, of the legacy he'd inherited, of the empty house and the hollow success that had defined his life for too many years. Maybe because I'm tired of playing it safe, he said finally. Maybe because some things are worth the risk. Outside, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the ranch, and somewhere in the distance, June's horse whinnied softly in her stall. The sound carried on the Montana wind like a promise that some bonds, once formed, couldn't be easily broken. The decision was made, though neither of them spoke it aloud. The gold wedding ring on June's finger caught the light, a reminder of vows that had turned to chains. But in this quiet room, with this unexpected man offering her something she'd almost forgotten existed, she began to remember what it felt like to hope. The ledger book lay open on the kitchen table between them, its pages filled with Cass's precise handwriting columns of numbers, breeding records, feed schedules, and veterinary notes that chronicled the daily life of the ranch. June ran her finger down the entries, her touch careful and reverent, as if she understood she was being trusted with something precious. Your record keeping is meticulous, she said, looking up from the page detailing the lineage of his prize stallion, Thunder's Echo. Most ranchers I've known keep everything in their heads or scribbled on whatever paper they can find. My father taught me that a ranch runs on information, Cass replied, refilling her coffee cup. Know your animals, know your land, know your numbers. Everything else is just guesswork. It had been a week since June had awakened in his guest room, and in that time she'd surprised him daily with her competence. Despite her injury's ribs that were still tender, a healing cut on her forehead, she'd insisted on helping around. The ranch. Her knowledge of horses was evident from the first morning, when she'd walked into the barn and correctly identified the early signs of colic in one of his mares. Moonbeam's been pawing at her stall all morning, she told him, her voice carrying the authority of experience. And look at how she keeps turning to look at her flanks. Classic signs. She'd been right, of course. Dr. Morrison had confirmed the diagnosis and praised June's quick thinking. The mare recovered fully, but the incident had established June's credibility with the ranch hands who'd been eyeing her with curious suspicion. Now, as she helped him update the breeding records, Cass found himself appreciating not just her skill, but her presence. The house felt different with her in it, less like a monument to solitude, and more like a home where people actually lived. Your stallion's bloodline is impressive, she continued, tracing the genealogy with her finger. Thunder's Echo could command serious stud fees with a pedigree like this. He does well enough, Cass said, though he couldn't hide his pride. His offspring have won championships in 3 states. And Buttercup? June asked, glancing toward the barn. Where does she fit in your breeding program? Cass looked up from his own paperwork, surprised by the question. I hadn't thought about it. She's your horse. She is, but she's also pregnant. The words hung in the air between them. Cass set down his pen slowly, processing this information. You're certain? About 6 weeks along, I'd guess. I've been watching for the signs since she arrived. The way she's been eating, her temperament changes Buttercup's carrying a foal. This changed things in ways both practical and symbolic. A pregnant mare needed special care, couldn't travel hard or far. It was another thread binding June to the ranch. Another reason she couldn't simply disappear into the night if trouble came calling. "Who's the sire?" he asked. June's expression darkened. "Marcus's stallion. A mean-spirited animal he called Kings. Ransom. Valuable bloodlines, but vicious temperament." Marcus thought it was funny that the horse was as cruel as he was. Cass made a note in the margin of the ledger. "We'll make sure she gets the best care. And when the foal comes, it'll have a good home here." The simple declaration brought tears to June's eyes, tears she tried to hide by turning back to the paperwork. But Cass had seen them, and he understood. She'd grown accustomed to uncertainty, to having everything she cared about held hostage to another's whims. The promise that her horse's offspring would be safe was more precious than he might have realized. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of boots on the front porch. Through the window, Cass could see Sheriff Patterson's familiar silhouette, and his stomach tightened. He'd been expecting this visit for days. "Stay here," he told June quietly. "Let me handle this." But she was already closing the ledger, her movements quick and efficient. "It's about me, isn't it?" "Probably. But that doesn't mean anything has to change." Sheriff Ben Patterson had known Cass for 15 years, ever since he'd been elected to office. He was a fair man, honest in his dealings, but he also understood the political realities of his position. The Rourke family contributed significantly to local charities and political campaigns. Their opinions carried weight in the county. "Afternoon." "Cass," Patterson said when Cass opened the door. "Hope I'm not interrupting anything important. Just paperwork." "Come in, Ben. Coffee?" "That'd be appreciated." Patterson stepped inside, his trained eyes taking in the scene, the ledger on the table, the 2 coffee cups, the subtle signs that the house was being lived in by more than one person. "I'll be direct," Patterson said, accepting the offered cup. "I've been getting inquiries about a woman who might be in the area. Goes by June Harper, though that might not be her real name. Wanted in connection with a theft in Wyoming." Cass kept his expression neutral. "What kind of theft?" "Valuable documents, apparently. Her husband's pressing charges. Says she took off with papers worth a considerable sum. He's got private investigators working the case, and they've traced her trail to this area." "And you think she might be here?" Patterson studied his face. "The investigators seem to think so. They're offering a substantial reward for information leading to her recovery." He paused. "They're also suggesting she might be dangerous, mentally unstable. Her husband's concerned for her welfare." Through the kitchen doorway, Cass could see June standing frozen by the sink, listening to every word. Her face had gone pale, but her jaw was set with determination. "That's an interesting story," Cass said carefully. "But you know how these private investigators can be. Sometimes the truth gets stretched to fit the client's needs." "Sometimes," Patterson agreed. "But I have to investigate any credible reports. And the fact is, someone matching her description was seen in Billings a few days ago, heading this direction. Ben, in all the years you've known me, have I ever given you reason to doubt my word? Never. Then I'm telling you now, if I thought there was a dangerous person on my property, I'd call you myself. You know that." Patterson nodded slowly, but his expression remained troubled. "The thing is, Cass, these investigators aren't just asking nicely. They're making noise about federal jurisdiction, about interstate flight and stolen property. If this woman is here, and if you're harboring her, it could cause you serious problems. I appreciate the warning. I hope you do." Patterson set down his coffee cup and stood. "Because whatever's going on, I'd hate to see you get caught in the middle of something that could hurt you." After the sheriff left, Cass found June in the kitchen, her hands gripping the edge of the sink so tightly her knuckles were white. "He seemed like a decent man," she said without turning around. "He is, but he's also got a job to do, and pressure from above can make good men do things they don't want to do. I should go. Tonight, while it's dark. Before I cause you any more trouble. Where? Cass asked. On a pregnant horse with no money and half the law enforcement in 3 states looking for you? She turned to face him, and he could see the fear in her eyes, warring with desperate determination. Then, what do you suggest? We get ahead of this, he said. We contact a lawyer, build a case, expose what your husband was really doing. The truth has to count for something. Marcus has lawyers, Cass. Good ones. Expensive ones. What do I have? He moved closer, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes, close enough that he could smell the faint scent of lavender soap that Mrs. Henley kept in the guest bathroom. You have me, he said simply, and whatever resources that brings to the fight. The ledger book lay forgotten on the table behind them, its neat columns and careful records, a testament to the ordered life Cass had built. But order, he was beginning to understand, wasn't the same thing as living. And sometimes, the most important decisions couldn't be reduced to numbers in a book. Outside, storm clouds were gathering over the crazy mountains, and the first drops of rain began to patter against the kitchen windows. The quilt had been folded in the cedar chest for nearly 15 years, wrapped in tissue paper and lavender sachets, like a memory too precious to disturb. Cass's mother had stitched it by hand during the long Montana winters, each square a tiny masterpiece of patience and love. Now, as he lifted it from its resting place, a scent of lavender mixed with something deeper, the indefinable essence of a woman who had made this house a home. June sat curled in the window seat of the library, a book of poetry forgotten in her lap as she stared out at the evening sky. The nightmares had been coming more frequently, jolting her awake with her heart racing and Marcus's voice echoing in her ears. She'd taken to staying up later, afraid to sleep, afraid to let her guard down, even in the safety of Cass's home. You look cold, he said from the doorway. The quilt draped over his arm dot. She glanced up, startled. She'd been so lost in thought she hadn't heard him approach. I'm fine, just thinking. But she wasn't fine, and they both knew it. Despite her efforts to hide it, the strain was showing. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and she'd grown thin in the 2 weeks since her arrival. She pushed herself during the day, working with the horses until she was exhausted. But the nights brought no peace dot without asking permission. Cass approached the window seat and gently draped the quilt around her shoulders. The fabric was soft as silk, the colors rich and warm deep blues and warm golds, arranged in a pattern called wedding ring, though he didn't mention that detail. This was my mother's, he said, settling into the chair across from her. She made it the year before she died. Took her 8 months, working on it every evening after dinner. June pulled the quilt closer, her fingers tracing the intricate stitching. It's beautiful. She must have been very talented. She was, but more than that, she was patient. I used to watch her work on it, night after night, and wonder how she could take so much care with something that would just end up on a bed somewhere. And now I think I understand. It wasn't about the finished product. It was about the love that went into each stitch, the hope that someday it would comfort someone who needed it. The words hung between them, weighted with meaning neither quite dared to acknowledge. June buried her face in the soft fabric, breathing in the faint scent of lavender and something else, something that spoke of home and safety and the kind of love she'd almost forgotten existed. You didn't have to give me this, she said, her voice muffled by the quilt. She would have wanted me to. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, the library around them filled with the weight of years and the soft ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Finally, June spoke again. Tell me about her. Your mother. Cass leaned back in his chair, his eyes distant with memory. Eleanor Rourke was about as different from my father as a woman could be. He was all business and practicality, but she saw magic in ordinary things. She could make Christmas morning feel special with nothing but pine cones and ribbon. or turn a thunderstorm into an adventure by building blanket forts in the living room. She sounds wonderful. She was. But she was also lonely, I think. My father loved her, but he didn't understand her need for beauty, for connection. After she died, I realized how much of the warmth in this house had come from her. June studied, his face in the lamplight, seeing past the successful rancher to the boy who had lost his mother too young. How old were you? 22. Old enough that people expected me to handle it like a man, but young enough that I still needed her. He paused. I think that's when I started building walls. It seemed easier than risking that kind of loss again. But walls keep good things out too. Yes, he said simply. They do. A comfortable warmth had settled between them, the kind that came from shared vulnerability. June found herself relaxing for the first time in weeks. The quilt wrapped around her like armor against the darkness outside. The horses trust you, she said, changing the subject to safer ground. I watched you with Thunder's echo this morning. He responds to you like you're speaking his language. In a way, I am. Horses don't lie, don't pretend to be something they're not. If you're patient with them, honest with them, they'll give you everything they have. Unlike people, some people. His eyes met hers. But I'm learning that the right person can be just as trustworthy as any horse I've ever worked with. The comment brought color to her cheeks, and she looked away. Outside, the wind was picking up, rattling the windows and sending autumn leaves dancing across the yard. The sound made her shiver, not from cold, but from the reminder that winter was coming, and with it, the need to make decisions about her future. Cass, she began, then stopped, unsure how to voice what she was thinking. What is it? When this is over, when we figure out what to do about Marcus and the documents, what happens then? He was quiet for a long moment, considering the question and all its implications. What do you want to happen? I don't know. For so long, I've been focused just on surviving, on getting away. I haven't let myself think about what comes after. Maybe it's time to start. She pulled the quilt tighter around herself, drawing strength from its warmth. I used to have dreams before Marcus. I wanted to breed horses, maybe train them. I had this fantasy of having my own small ranch somewhere, nothing fancy, just a place where I could work with animals and feel like I was building something good. That doesn't sound like a fantasy. That sounds like a plan. Plans require resources, money, land, connections. Things I don't have. Things that can be acquired, he said gently, if you're willing to work for them. The suggestion hung in the air between them, unspoken but understood. He was offering her a future, a chance to rebuild not just her life, but her dreams. The thought was both thrilling and terrifying. Before she could respond, the sound of vehicles approaching broke the quiet evening. Through the window, they could see headlights turning up the long drive, not one vehicle, but several, their lights cutting through the darkness like searching eyes. June's face went pale. They found me. Cass moved to the window, his jaw tightening as he counted the vehicles. Maybe, but they're not law enforcement wrong kind of cars, wrong approach. These look like private security. Marcus's people. June's voice was barely a whisper. He said he'd find me wherever I went. Then we'd better make sure they don't find what they're looking for. Cass turned from the window, his expression grim but determined. The documents, where are they? Hidden in Buttercup's stall, sewn into the lining of her blanket. Good. Leave them there for now. Whatever happens, don't let them know you have those papers. The headlights were getting closer, and June could make out the dark shapes of at least 3 vehicles. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she stood, the quilt still wrapped around her shoulders like a shield. What do we do? Cass moved to the gun cabinet in the corner of the library, withdrawing a shotgun and checking its load with practiced efficiency. We handle this like we handle everything else on the ranch, carefully, but without backing down. Outside, the vehicles came to a stop in the circular drive, their engines ticking in the sudden silence. Car doors slammed, and voices could be heard, low and urgent. June reached for Cass's hand, her fingers cold despite the quilt's warmth. "I'm sorry. I never meant to bring this to your door." He squeezed her hand gently, his touch steady and reassuring. "Some things are worth the risk, June. You're learning to trust again, and so am I." The doorbell rang, its sound echoing through the house like a challenge. Cass checked the shotgun one more time, then looked at June with expression that mixed determination with something deeper, something that looked suspiciously like love, though neither of them was ready to name it yet. "Stay behind me," he said. "And remember, you're not alone anymore." The quilt settled around her shoulders like a benediction as they walked toward the front door, toward whatever waited in the darkness beyond. The broken bridle lay across the workbench like a wounded animal, its leather straps torn and hardware bent from years of hard use. June ran her fingers along the damaged sections, assessing what could be salvaged and what would need to be replaced entirely. It was the kind of repair work that most people would consider beyond saving. But she'd learned long ago that broken things often just needed the right kind of attention. "Found it in the back of the tack room," Cass said, setting down a cup of coffee beside her. "Been meaning to throw it out for months, but somehow never got around to it." "Good thing you didn't." June selected a piece of replacement leather from the supply drawer. "This is quality work underneath all the damage. Hand-stitched, probably 50 years old or more. They don't make them like this anymore." It had been 3 days since Marcus's men had come to the door. 3 men in expensive suits who'd introduced themselves as private investigators, flashing credentials and asking polite questions about a missing woman who might be in the area. Cass had handled them with the smooth authority of a man accustomed to dealing with unwanted visitors, courteous but firm, helpful but revealing nothing. No, he hadn't seen anyone matching that description. Yes, he'd be sure to call if anyone turned up. No, they were not welcome to search his property without a warrant. The men had left with frustrated expressions and thinly veiled threats about federal involvement. But they'd left. For now, the incident had shaken June more than she'd admitted. Not just because they'd found her, but because of how close they'd come to discovering the documents. If they'd thought to search the barn, if they'd been more aggressive in their approach, everything could have unraveled in a matter of minutes. "You're thinking about them again," Cass observed, watching her work. Hard not to. She pulled the needle through the leather with steady strokes, her movements precise despite the tremor in her hands. "They'll be back. Maybe not those same men, but others. Marcus doesn't give up easily. Neither do one." The simple statement carried weight, and June looked up from her work to meet his eyes. In the 3 weeks she'd been at the ranch, she'd watched him handle everything from difficult horses to demanding business partners with the same quiet confidence. But this was different. This was personal in a way that business dealings never were. "You could lose everything," she said softly. "The ranch, your reputation, your standing in the community. People are already talking." That much was true. Mrs. Henley had mentioned the whispers in town, the speculation about the mysterious woman staying at the Rourke place. Some of the talk was merely curious, but some carried darker implications, suggestions that perhaps the wealthy bachelor had finally taken up with someone unsuitable, someone with a questionable past. Let them talk. Cass settled onto the stool beside her workbench. "I spent too many years caring what people thought. It's a lonely way to live." June's needle paused in its work. "But your business relationships will survive or they won't. The horses speak for themselves, and so do the breeding records. Anyone who'd stopped doing business with me over gossip wasn't much of a partner to begin with." She resumed stitching, but her mind was clearly elsewhere. In Wyoming, Marcus controlled everything through social pressure. He was charming, well-connected, the kind of man other men wanted to be friends with. When he wanted to isolate me, All he had to do was start the right kind of rumors. People stopped calling, stopped visiting. I became invisible. You're not invisible here. Not yet, but I've seen how quickly things can change when people decide you're not worth defending. Cass watched her work, noting the way her shoulders carried tension like a familiar burden. She'd learned to expect abandonment, to assume that when things got difficult, she'd be left to face them alone. The realization made something ache in his chest. "Tell me about the nightmares," he said quietly, her hands stilled on the bridle. "How did you— I hear you moving around at night. The floorboards in the old house creak. You're not sleeping." June set down the needle and rubbed her eyes, suddenly looking older than her 32 years. "They're not always about Marcus. Sometimes they're about running, about being chased by faceless people who want to hurt me. Sometimes they're about losing Buttercup, or about the documents being found, or about waking up and finding out this has all been a dream. And sometimes they're about you sending me away." The admission came out barely above a whisper, "about you deciding I'm too much trouble, too dangerous to keep around." The words hung between them like a confession. Cass reached out slowly, covering her hands with his own. Her skin was warm from the work, marked with small scars that spoke of a life lived close to horses and hard labor. "June, look at me." She raised her eyes reluctantly, and he could see the fear there, not of physical violence, but of emotional abandonment. It was the kind of fear that came from loving people who had proven themselves unworthy of that love. "I'm not going anywhere," he said, "and neither are you, unless that's what you choose. You can't promise that. You don't know what Marcus is capable of, what lengths he'll go to. Then tell me, help me understand what we're really facing." June pulled her hands free and stood, moving to the window that looked out over the paddocks where the horses grazed in the afternoon sun. Buttercup was among them, her pregnancy just beginning to show, her coat gleaming from the good care she'd received. "Marcus doesn't just hit," she said, her voice carrying the weight of painful memory. "He destroys. When I first tried to leave him, 2 years ago, I went to stay with my sister in Colorado. Within a week, her husband had lost his job he'd held for 8 years. Their mortgage application was denied. Their daughter was turned down for a scholarship she'd been promised. She turned back to face him. Marcus called me that night, very calm, very reasonable. He explained how these things could keep happening to people I cared about, or how they could stop. All I had to do was come home and be a good wife." Cass felt anger building in his chest, cold and precise. "So you went back." "I went back, and I learned to be very careful about who I trusted, who I allowed to get close to me, because caring about me could cost people everything they'd worked for. That's not love, June. That's terrorism. I know that now, but knowing something and feeling it are different things." She returned to the workbench, picking up the bridle again. "I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop, for you to realize that helping me isn't worth the cost." Cass stood and moved. To stand beside her, close enough that he could smell the scent of leather and saddle soap that seemed to follow her everywhere. "What if I told you that helping you has been the most worthwhile thing I've done in years?" Her hands trembled slightly as she resumed her stitching. "I'd say you haven't seen the bill yet. Maybe not. But I've seen you with the horses, seen the way you care for living things. I've watched you take something broken," he gestured to the bridle, "and make it whole again. I've seen your strength, your courage, your capacity for hope even after everything you've been through." The needle slipped, pricking her finger. A drop of blood welled up, bright red against her pale skin. Without thinking, Cass reached for her hand, examining the small wound. "It's nothing," she said, but she didn't. "Pull away. Everything matters," he replied, holding her hand gently. "Every small hurt, every act of kindness, every choice to trust or to run, it all matters." Their eyes met and held, and for a moment the weight of their circumstances fell away. In the space between one heartbeat and the next, June felt something shift inside her chest, a loosening of the fear that had been her constant companion for so long. "Cass," she began, but the sound of approaching vehicles cut her off. Through the window, they could see Sheriff Patterson's cruiser coming up the drive, followed by a black sedan with government plates. June's face went pale, and her hand tightened. "In his federal marshals," Cass said grimly, recognizing the type of vehicle. Marcus escalated. "They'll have warrants this time, real ones." Cass released her hand and moved to the gun cabinet, checking the loads on both the shotgun and his pistol. "Then we'd better make sure they don't find what they're looking for." June looked down at the bridle in her hands, its repair only half finished. Sometimes, she thought, broken things didn't get the chance to be mended. Sometimes they just broke. A little more, but then she felt Cass's hand on her shoulder, steady and warm, and remembered that she wasn't facing this alone anymore. The family photograph had been hidden behind other pictures on the mantelpiece for so long that even Cass had almost forgotten it existed. June found it while dusting the library, a simple silver frame tucked away like a memory too painful to display but too precious to discard. In the faded color image, a younger Cass stood between his parents, all three of them squinting against bright summer sunshine, genuine smiles on their faces. "You were happy then," June said, holding the frame carefully as Cass entered the room with their evening coffee. He paused, seeing what she'd discovered. "I was 12. Everything seemed possible at 12. Your father looked stern, even in this picture. He was, but he was also fair, in his way. He had expectations for the ranch, for the family name, for me. Sometimes I wonder if I've spent my whole life trying to live up to those expectations or rebel against them." June studied the photograph more closely. Eleanor Rourke stood beside her husband, with her hand resting lightly on young Cass's shoulder, her expression warm and radiant, even in the faded colors of the old film. Her beauty was evident, not the polished perfection of a society woman, but something deeper and more genuine. "She looks like she was lit from within," June observed. She was. Mother had this way of seeing the best in everyone, everything. My father used to say she could find beauty in a pile of horseshoes if she looked long enough. Cass settled into his chair, accepting the coffee gratefully. After she died, the house felt like a museum. Beautiful, well-maintained, but empty of life. "Is that why you never married? Because you were afraid of losing someone again?" The question hung in the air between them, more personal than anything they'd discussed before. Cass stared into his coffee cup, watching the steam rise like ghosts of conversations never had. "Partly," he admitted, "but also because I never found anyone who made me want to risk it. The women I met were either interested in the ranch or intimidated by it. They saw the money, the status, but not the man. And now?" He looked up to meet her eyes. "Now I'm beginning to remember what it feels like to be seen." The words carried weight that made June's breath catch. In the 3 weeks since the federal marshals had searched the ranch finding nothing, thanks to Cass's foresight in moving the documents to a safe deposit box in town, their relationship had deepened in ways that neither had quite expected. Search had been thorough but fruitless. Armed with warrants and grim determination, the marshals had torn through the house and barn, looking for evidence of harboring a fugitive. They'd questioned the ranch hands, examined every building, even brought in dogs to search for hidden compartments. But Cass's reputation and his lawyer's presence had kept them from being too aggressive, and June's identity documents, skillfully forged by a contact of Cass's attorney, had held up under scrutiny. Still, the message had been clear. Marcus. Harper had friends in high places, and this wasn't going away quietly. "I keep thinking about what you said," June continued, setting the photograph carefully on the side table. "About spending your life trying to live up to expectations or rebel against them. I understand it more than you might think. How so? She curled up in the chair across from him, pulling her knees to her chest. It was a defensive posture she'd developed during her marriage, making herself smaller, less of a target. But here, in the warm lamplight of the library, it seemed more like seeking comfort than protection. Before Marcus, I was the good daughter, the one who never caused trouble. I married him partly because he was exactly what my parents expected: successful, respectable, charming. I thought that if I could be the perfect wife, live the perfect life they'd envisioned for me, then I'd finally be worthy of love. And when it went wrong, I blamed myself. If the perfect life wasn't working, then I must not be perfect enough. So I tried harder, made myself smaller, quieter, more accommodating. It took me years to realize that the problem wasn't with me, it was with their definition of perfect. Cass leaned forward, his expression intent. What would your definition be? June was quiet for a long moment, considering the question seriously. I think perfect might be being truly known by someone and loved anyway. Not loved despite your flaws, but loved including them, because they're part of what makes you whole. That sounds terrifying. It is, but the alternative, being loved for a mask you wear, is worse, because then you're always afraid the mask will slip. Thunder rolled outside, and June glanced toward the windows, where rain was beginning to streak the glass. The weather had been unsettled for days, matching the tension that seemed to permeate everything since the federal search. Cass, she said carefully, what happens when this is over? When we've dealt with Marcus and the documents and all the legal complications? What do you want to happen? I want to stay. The words came out in a rush, as if she'd been holding them back for days. Not just because I'm safe here, but because this feels like home in a way nowhere else ever has. He set down his coffee cup and moved to kneel beside her chair, taking her hands in his. Her fingers were cold, despite the warmth of the room, and he could feel the slight tremor that spoke of nerves stretched thin. Then stay, he said simply. It's not that simple. People talk. An unmarried woman living with a bachelor. Let them talk. Your business relationships, your standing in the community. June. His voice was firm but gentle. I've spent 23 years building something I thought mattered. But sitting here with you, I realize I was building a monument to loneliness. I want to build something different now. Something real. She searched his face, looking for doubt or reservation. Instead, she found only honesty and something that looked like the kind of love she'd stopped believing existed. I'm scared, she whispered. So am I. What if I can't be what you need? What if the damage Marcus did is too deep to heal completely? Cass reached up to touch her face, his thumb gentle against her cheek. What if you're exactly what I need, damage and all? What if we heal each other? The rain was coming harder now, drumming against the windows with increasing intensity. June leaned into his touch, closing her eyes and allowing herself to imagine a future that didn't involve running, hiding, or looking over her shoulder. The documents, she said suddenly, even if we can use them to expose Marcus, even if we win, there will always be people who remember. People who think I'm the kind of woman who destroys men for money. And there will be people who know the truth. People who matter. Like who? Like Dr. Morrison, who's seen how you care for the horses. Like Mrs. Henley, who says you have the kindest hands she's ever seen. Like the ranch hands who've watched you work 16-hour days without complaint. Like me. June opened her eyes, and in them Cass could see the war between hope and fear that had been raging since the day she'd awakened in his guest room. I love you, she said quietly, the words falling between them like stones dropped into still water. I didn't mean to, and I tried not to, but I do. I love you too, he replied. And the simple declaration seemed to change the very air in the room. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their confession settling around them like a benediction. Outside, the storm was building, But inside the library, surrounded by books and lamplight, and the quiet presence of the family photograph, June felt something she hadn't experienced in years. She felt safe enough to hope. "Cass," she said, her voice stronger now, "whatever comes next, I want to face it with you. Not behind you, not protected by you, but beside you." He smiled, as she saw in his expression the same mixture of fear and determination that she felt in her own heart. "Then that's what we'll do," he said. "Together." The photograph watched over them from the side table, 3 faces captured in a moment of genuine happiness, a reminder that love, real love, was worth any risk, any sacrifice, any fight that might be required to protect it. The land deed was yellowed with age, its edges worn soft from handling, but the official seals and signatures were still clearly visible. June stared at the document spread across the kitchen table, her face pale with shock and something that looked like recognition dawning. "I remember this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Marcus had me sign it right after we were married. He said it was just paperwork, something about consolidating our assets." Cass leaned over her shoulder, reading the legal language that had seemed so innocuous when his attorney had first discovered it among the documents they'd retrieved from the safe deposit box. But now, with the revelation of what it actually meant, the words took on a sinister new significance. "According to this," he said carefully, "your signature transferred ownership of a substantial mineral claim to your husband, a claim that encompasses roughly 4,000 acres of what is now the Rourke Ranch." June's hands trembled as she traced the signature that was undeniably hers, written in the careful script she'd learned as a schoolgirl. "I never knew what I was signing. He just put papers in front of me and told me to sign. He said wives needed to trust their husbands with business matters." The implications were staggering. If the deed was legitimate, and the county records that Cass's lawyer had pulled suggested it was, then Marcus Harper had a legal claim to nearly a third of the Rourke Ranch, including some of the most valuable grazing land and the water rights. That made the entire operation possible. "How is this possible?" June asked, her voice growing stronger as anger began to override shock. "My family never owned land in Montana. We were farmers in Nebraska, small-time farmers who barely owned the 40 acres we lived on." Cass pulled out a chair and sat heavily, the weight of revelation settling over him like a physical thing. "The original claim was filed in 1923 by someone named James Arden, according to the research my attorney did. Arden was your great-grandfather, your mother's grandfather. I never heard that name in my life. Apparently he came west during the mining boom, filed a claim for mineral rights, then disappeared. The claim was never developed, never transferred, just sat in the county records gathering dust. When my great-grandfather bought this land in 1889, there was no mention of any outstanding mineral claims." June stood abruptly, pacing to the window that looked out over the land they'd been talking about. In the distance, cattle grazed peacefully, unaware that their very presence was now in question. "So Marcus somehow discovered this old claim and traced it to me through genealogy records," she said, working through the logic. "Then he courted me, married me, and had me sign papers transferring the rights to him. It appears so. The marriage was just a means to an end, a way to get legal ownership of something potentially worth millions." The words hung in the air between them like an accusation. June turned from the window, her face a mask of controlled fury. 3 years, she said. 3 years of hell, of being beaten and broken and made to feel worthless, and it was all just business to him. Cass felt something cold and dangerous building in his chest. He'd thought he understood the depths of Marcus Harper's cruelty, but this revelation added layers of calculation and manipulation that went beyond simple abuse. This was systematic, premeditated evil disguised as romance. "June," he said gently, "there's more." She turned to face him, and he could see her bracing herself for another blow. The geological surveys my attorney ordered came back yesterday. There are significant copper deposits under that land, along with some rare earth minerals that are becoming increasingly valuable. Conservative estimates put the mineral rights at somewhere between $15 and $20 million. June sank into her chair as if her legs would no longer support her. 20 million. Now we understand why he's been so persistent in hunting you down. It's not just about getting you back. It's about securing the biggest score of his life. But the documents I took, the ones we've been hiding, they're forgeries, right? You said your family's claim goes back 4 generations. Our surface rights do. But mineral rights can be separate from surface rights, especially with these old claims. If the deed you signed is legitimate, then Marcus has a valid claim to everything under the ground, even if I own everything above. The kitchen fell silent, except for the ticking of the wall clock and the distant sound of horses moving in the paddock. June stared at the deed as if it might change its contents under her scrutiny. There has to be a way to fight this, she said finally. Some legal loophole, some way to prove the documents are fraudulent. My attorney is working on it. But June, there's something else you need to know. Cass hesitated, knowing that what he was about to tell her would hurt, but understanding that she needed to hear it. The investigator we hired discovered that you're not the first woman Marcus has done this to. June looked up sharply. What do you mean? There were 2 others over the past 10 years. Different states, different names he used, but the same pattern. Research genealogy records. Identify women who might have inherited mineral or land rights they're unaware of, then court and marry them to gain access to those rights. What happened to them? Cass's expression grew grim. The first one, Sarah Mitchell in Colorado, died in what was ruled an accidental fall, 6 months after she signed over some valuable water rights. The second, Lisa Chun in Nevada, disappeared entirely after transferring ownership of a silver mine, claim her grandfather had filed in the 1940s. June's face went white. He killed them. We can't prove that. But the pattern is concerning. And I was supposed to be the third. June's voice was steady now, though her hands were clenched so tightly her knuckles showed white. After he got the mineral rights, after he'd extracted everything of value from our marriage, I was supposed to have an accident too. That's our theory, which means that when you took those documents, you didn't just escape an abusive marriage. You escaped a death sentence. June stood again, moving to the kitchen counter, where she gripped the edge with both hands. Cass could see her shoulders shaking, but when she spoke, her voice was controlled. The forged documents I took, they're not just about this property, are they? No. There are claims for properties in 4 states, all traced back to women who fit the same profile as you. Women with family histories they knew nothing about, inherited rights they were unaware of, vulnerabilities that made them perfect targets. How many women is he planning to kill for money? As many as it takes, apparently. The investigator estimates the total value of all the claims at over $50 million. June turned back to face him, and Cass was struck by the transformation. In her expression, the fear was still there, but it was overlaid now with something harder and more determined. We have to stop him, she said. Not just for us, but for whatever woman he's planning to target next. June, this is bigger than we thought. This isn't just about a local criminal anymore. This is organized fraud on a massive scale. We're talking about federal crimes, murder, conspiracy. The kind of case that takes years to build and even longer to prosecute. Then we'd better get started. Cass studied her face, seeing the resolve that had carried her across 3 states. On an exhausted horse, the strength that had kept her fighting when everything in her life had been stripped away. What are you thinking? I'm thinking that Marcus made a mistake when he let me live long enough to discover what he was really doing. And I'm thinking that a man who's been getting away with murder for 10 years might have gotten careless about covering his tracks. She moved to the desk in the corner of the kitchen and pulled out a notebook, her movements sudden and purposeful. "What are you doing?" "Making a list. Every conversation I remember, every document I saw, every person Marcus spoke to on the phone when he thought I wasn't listening. If we're going to bring him down, we need to know everything he's done and everyone he's worked with." Cass watched her write, her pen moving quickly across the page as memories that had seemed insignificant at the time took on new meaning in light of what they now knew. "June," he said quietly, "are you sure you're ready for this? Because once we start down this path, there's no going back. He'll know we're coming for him, and that will make him even more dangerous." She looked up from her writing, and in her eyes he saw not the frightened woman who had collapsed in his barn a month ago, but someone who had found her strength and was ready to use it. "Cass, for 3 years I believed I was worthless, but I deserved everything that happened to me. But now I know the truth. I was never his victim. I was his mark. And the difference between those two things changes everything. The land deed lay between them on the table, a piece of paper that had altered the stakes of their fight beyond anything they could have imagined. But as Cass watched June compile her list of evidence, he realized that perhaps Marcus Harper had miscalculated in ways that went beyond simple greed. He had underestimated the woman he tried to break, and that mistake might be the one that finally brought him down. A shotgun felt heavier than Cass remembered when he lifted it from his father's old gun case. The weapon had belonged to 3 generations of Rourke men, its walnut stock worn smooth by decades of handling. His great-grandfather had carried it during the harsh winters of the 1890s. His grandfather had used it to protect the ranch during the Depression, and his father had taught him to hunt with it when he was barely tall enough to hold its steady dot now, as he cleaned and loaded the familiar weapon. Cass understood that he might be called upon to use it for the most important purpose of all, protecting the woman he loved. "The FBI agent wants to meet tomorrow morning," June said, entering the study with a stack of documents in her hands. "Agent Sarah Martinez. She's flying in from Denver, specifically to hear our testimony." It had been 2 weeks since the revelation about the land deed, 2 weeks of intensive investigation and legal maneuvering that had transformed their quiet ranch into the center of a federal criminal investigation. The evidence June had compiled from her memories, combined with the investigative work of Cass's attorney and the FBI's own resources, had painted a picture of Marcus Harper that was far more sinister than either of them had initially imagined. "What did she say about the other cases?" Cass asked, checking the shotgun's action one final time before returning it to its case. "Sarah Mitchell's death is being reopened as a homicide investigation. They found inconsistencies in the original report that suggest the fall wasn't accidental. And Lisa Chun, they think they found her body in a mine shaft outside Reno." June's voice was steady as she delivered this news, but Cass could see the cost of such control in the tightness around her eyes, the careful way she held herself. Learning that she'd been marked for death, that she'd escaped a fate that had befallen other women, had changed something fundamental in her. The fear was still there, but it was tempered now by a cold anger that burned like banked coals. "How many others do they think there might be?" he asked. "Agent Martinez says they've identified at least 6 more women who married men matching Marcus's description over the past 15 years. 3 of them died in accidents within a year of the marriage. 2 others disappeared. The 6th one—" June paused, consulting her notes. "The 6th one was found murdered in Oregon 3 months ago, Rebecca Torres. She'd inherited logging rights from her great-uncle." Cass felt his jaw tighten. All of them had inherited rights they didn't know about. All of them. Marcus had a whole system worked out: genealogy researchers, private investigators, even people working in county record offices who would tip him off to unclaimed inheritances. It's been his full-time business for over a decade. And now he knows we're building a case against him. That was the part that kept Cass awake at night. Their investigation had necessarily involved reaching out to law enforcement agencies in multiple states, interviewing people who had known Marcus's victims, and following paper trails that led back to him. There was no way to conduct such an investigation quietly, which meant that Marcus Harper was almost certainly aware that his carefully constructed life was unraveling. Agent Martinez says we should expect him to make a move soon, June continued. Men like Marcus don't run when they're cornered, they fight, and they usually target the person they see as responsible for their downfall. You, me. She set the documents aside and moved to the window, gazing out at the ranch where life continued its normal rhythm despite the storm clouds gathering around them. He's lost access to the mineral rights, lost his cover identity, and lost the woman who was supposed to be his next victim. From his perspective, I've cost him everything. Cass joined her at the window, following her gaze to where the ranch hands were bringing the horses in from the far pasture. It was a scene of peaceful industry that had played out on this land for over a century. But now it felt fragile, threatened by forces that had nothing to do with weather or market prices or the natural challenges of ranch life. The security team arrives tonight, he said. 3 men, all former military, all with experience in this kind of situation. June nodded, though he could see she wasn't entirely comfortable with the idea of armed guards patrolling the ranch. And the hands? Tom and Miguel know the situation. They're both armed, and they know to stay alert. The others think we're just taking precautions because of some threats from environmental groups about the cattle operation. It was a necessary deception. The fewer people who knew the full details of what they were facing, the less chance there was of information leaking to the wrong ears. But it also meant that most of the people working on the ranch were unaware of the danger that might be heading their way. Cass, June said, turning from the window to face him. I need you to promise me something. He could see from her expression that whatever she was about to ask wouldn't be easy to agree to. If Marcus comes here, if he gets past the security, if something goes wrong, I need you to promise me you'll get yourself to safety. Don't try to be a hero. Don't risk everything you've built for me. June, please. Her voice carried a note of desperation that made his chest tighten. I've seen what he's capable of. I've watched him destroy people who tried to help me. I couldn't live with myself if something happened to you because of me. Cass reached for her hands, noting again how delicate they looked, despite the strength he knew they possessed. What kind of man would I be if I let the woman I love face this alone? A smart one? A living one? No. His voice was firm, carrying the same quiet authority that had made him successful in business and respected in the community. I'm not walking away, June. Not from this, and not from you. You don't understand what you're up against. Marcus isn't just violent, he's intelligent, patient, methodical. He's been planning murders for over a decade and getting away with them. He's not some hothead who'll come charging in with guns blazing. He'll wait, watch, find our weakest point, and then strike when we least expect it. Then we'll be ready. For him. June pulled her hands free and began pacing the small study, her movements quick and agitated. How can you be ready for someone who's made a career out of killing people? Someone who's had weeks to plan his approach, who has resources and connections and experience that we can't match. Because we have something he doesn't, Cass said quietly. What's that? We're fighting for something real. He's fighting to protect a lie. June stopped pacing and stared at him. You think that matters? You think having the moral high ground is going to stop a bullet? I think it matters more than you realize. Cass moved to his desk and pulled out a folder that had been delivered that morning. Agent Martinez sent over Marcus's psychological profile. Do you want to know what it says? June nodded reluctantly. It says he's a narcissist with sociopathic tendencies who sees other people as objects to be used for his benefit. But it also says he's fundamentally a coward who only attacks when he's certain he has overwhelming advantages. He's spent his career targeting isolated women who had no support systems, no one to fight for them. And your point is? My point is that you're not isolated anymore. You have me. You have the FBI. You have an entire community that's started to care about what happens to you. He's not dealing with a vulnerable woman alone in the world. He's dealing with people who will fight back. June considered this, and Cass could see the war between hope and fear playing out across her face. Mrs. Henley stopped by this morning. She said finally. She brought a casserole and told me that half the church ladies in town are praying for my safety. She said they don't care what I might have done in the past. They can see who I am now, and that's all that matters to them. See? You're not alone. Dr. Morrison offered to put me up at his place if I needed somewhere safer to stay. And Tom, your foreman, he told me yesterday that any man who would hurt a woman wasn't welcome on Rourke land, and he'd personally make sure of it. Cass smiled. Tom's a good man. So is Doc Morrison. I never expected that, June admitted. After everything Marcus told me about how the world works, about how people only help when there's something in it for them, I never expected strangers to care about what happens to me. Maybe Marcus was wrong about more than you realized. Before June could respond, the sound of vehicles approaching interrupted their conversation. Through the window, they could see a black SUV and a pickup truck coming up the drive, their headlights cutting through the gathering dusk. The security team, Cass said, checking his watch. Right on time. June watched the vehicles approach, and for the first time in days, some of the tension seemed to leave her shoulders. Cass, she said softly, whatever happens in the next few days, I want you to know that these past 2 months have been the happiest of my life. For the first time since I was a child, I've felt like I belonged somewhere, like I was home. He moved to stand beside her, close enough that he could smell the faint scent of horses and hay that seemed to follow her everywhere. This is your home, June. Whatever else happens, that doesn't change. Outside, the security team was unloading equipment from their vehicles, their movements professional and efficient. Soon the ranch would be transformed into a fortress, with armed guards and surveillance equipment, and all the trappings of a place under siege. But standing there in the warm light of the study, watching the sun set over land that had been in his family for 4 generations, Cass felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of purpose that went beyond profit margins and breeding records and the careful maintenance of his reputation. He was fighting for love, for justice, for the right of good people to live without fear. And that, he thought, was worth any risk Marcus Harper might pose. The branding iron glowed red-hot in the forge, its metal surface radiating heat that Cass could feel from across the barn. It was an old tool, one that had marked thousands of cattle with the Rourke brand over the decades, but tonight it served a different purpose. Tonight it was a weapon waiting to be used, should the need arise. The attack came at 3 a.m, just as Agent Martinez had predicted it would. Marcus Harper had chosen the darkest hour before dawn, when human alertness was at its lowest, and shadows provided the best cover. But the security team had been expecting exactly this approach, and their thermal imaging cameras picked up the intruders long before they reached the house. 4 men moving in from the north pasture, the team leader, Collins, reported through his radio. 2 more circling around to cut off the access road. They're armed and moving with military precision. Cass crouched behind the barn door, the shotgun steady in his hands, while June pressed herself against the wall beside him. They could hear boots moving carefully through the gravel outside, the soft whisper of tactical gear, the barely audible communication between Marcus's men as they closed in on the ranch house. They think we're still in the house, June whispered, her voice barely audible. That had been part of the plan. Collins and his team had set up a decoy operation, with lights on timers and even silhouettes moving past the windows to create the illusion that the house was occupied. Meanwhile, Cass and June had taken shelter in the barn, where they had better sight lines and multiple escape routes. Movement at the front door. Collins's voice crackled through the radio. They're using some kind of electronic lockpick. Professional-grade equipment. Through a crack in the barn door, Cass could see the ranch house 50 yards away. The porch light cast long shadows across the yard, and he could make out the dark shapes of men positioning themselves around the building. They moved with the kind of coordinated efficiency that spoke of extensive training and experience. These aren't just hired muscle, he murmured to June. Marcus brought professionals. He has connections to some very dangerous people, she replied. Men who do this kind of work for a living. The first explosion came from the direction of the house, not loud enough to be a bomb, but the sharp crack of a flashbang grenade designed to disorient anyone inside. It was followed immediately by the sound of splintering wood as the front door was breached. Now we move, Collins said through the radio. All teams, execute on my mark. What followed was a carefully choreographed dance of violence. The security team had positioned themselves in concealed locations around the property, and now they sprang their trap. Muzzle flashes lit up the darkness as gunfire erupted from multiple directions, catching Marcus's men in a crossfire they hadn't expected. But Marcus Harper was nowhere to be seen. He's not with them, June said, scanning the yard through binoculars. Marcus never gets his hands dirty if he can help it. He'll be watching from a distance, waiting to see how this plays out. Cass keyed his radio. Collins, the principal target, isn't here. This is a distraction. Copy that. Stay alert for. The barn door exploded inward in a shower of splinters and twisted metal. The blast threw Cass backward, his shotgun skittering across the concrete floor as he rolled behind a hay bale. Through the ringing in his ears, he could hear June crying out his name, but the smoke and debris made it impossible to see her. Well, a familiar voice said from the smoking doorway. The loving couple, hiding in a barn like frightened animals. Marcus Harper stepped through the wreckage, and Cass got his first look at the man who had made June's life a living hell. He was younger than Cass had expected, perhaps 40, with a kind of carefully maintained appearance that spoke of money and vanity. His clothes were expensive, his hair perfectly styled, his smile the practiced charm of a man who had made seduction into an art form. But his eyes were cold as winter stone. "Hello, darling," Marcus said to June, who was slowly picking herself up from behind an overturned workbench. "You've led me quite a chase. I hope you enjoyed your little vacation, because it's time to come home." "I am home," June said, her voice steady despite the blood trickling from a cut on her forehead. Marcus laughed, the sound sharp and humorless. "Home? With this cowboy?" "June, sweetheart, you were always too sentimental for your own good." Cass saw his shotgun lying 10 feet away, but Marcus's pistol was already trained on June. Any sudden movement would get her killed. "What do you want, Harper?" Cass asked, slowly rising to his feet with his hands visible. "What I want is what belongs to me," Marcus replied. "My wife, and the documents she stole. The mineral rights that she signed over to me in good faith." "Good faith?" June's voice carried a note of incredulous anger. "You mean the rights you tricked me into signing away? The rights you murdered other women to obtain?" Marcus's expression didn't change. "I prefer to think of it as aggressive business practices. The weak have always served the strong, June. It's the natural order of things." "The FBI knows everything," Cass said. "They have evidence connecting you to at least 8 murders. Even if you kill us tonight, you'll never be safe. Perhaps. But I'll be rich enough to disappear completely. $20 million buys a lot. Of new identities and safe harbors." Marcus's smile widened. "Besides, Once you and June have your tragic accident, and once those documents are destroyed, the case against me becomes much more difficult to prove. The branding iron still glowed in the forge behind Marcus, its heat shimmering in the air like a mirage. Cass measured the distance with his eyes, calculating angles and timing. He would only get one chance. "You're making a mistake," June said, taking a small step to the side. "The documents aren't here. We gave them to the FBI weeks ago." "Lies," Marcus snapped. "You're too possessive to give up your insurance policy. They're here somewhere, and you're going to tell me where." "And if I don't?" Marcus's expression grew cold. "Then I'll start cutting pieces off your cowboy boyfriend until you change your mind." That was when Cass moved. He dove toward the forge, his hand closing around the handle of the branding iron as Marcus spun toward him. The red-hot metal connected with Marcus's gun hand, and the man's scream of pain echoed through the barn as the pistol went flying. But Marcus wasn't finished. Even with his hand severely burned, he lunged forward with a combat knife that had appeared from somewhere on his person. The blade sliced across Cass's ribs, drawing blood and sending him stumbling backward. "You should have minded your own business, cowboy," Marcus snarled, advancing with the knife raised. June's voice cut through the chaos. "Marcus." He turned toward her, and that moment of distraction was all Cass needed. The shotgun was in his hands, loaded and ready, the familiar weight of it as natural as breathing. "It's over, Harper," he said. For the first time since entering the barn, Marcus Harper looked genuinely afraid. The marriage certificate was tucked inside Marcus's jacket pocket, and even as he raised his hands in apparent surrender, June could see the bulge where he kept his most valuable documents. She'd seen him check that pocket obsessively during their marriage, always making sure his insurance policies were close at hand. "The game's over, Marcus," Cass said, keeping the shotgun trained on the man's center mass. "Your men are down, the FBI is on the way, and you've got nowhere to run." Marcus's burned hand hung useless at his side, but his eyes remained calculating, searching for any opportunity to turn the situation to his advantage. "You think this is over? You think a simple arrest is going to stop this?" "It's a start," June said, moving to retrieve Marcus's dropped pistol. Her hands were steady now, all traces of the frightened woman who had fled across 3 states replaced by someone who had found her strength. "June, darling, you still don't understand how this works." Marcus's voice carried the same patronizing tone he'd used throughout their marriage. "I have connections in law enforcement, in the courts, in places you can't even imagine. Even if they arrest me tonight, I'll be out on bail within 48 hours. Not for murder," Cass replied grimly. "They found Lisa Chun's body in Nevada. The forensic evidence ties directly back to you." For the first time, uncertainty flickered across Marcus's face. "That's impossible." "I was careful. You left DNA evidence on her clothing. And the jewelry you took from her, you pawned it in Reno using a fake ID that traces back to one of your shell companies." June's voice was matter-of-fact, reciting information that Agent Martinez had shared with them. "You thought you were clever, but you got sloppy." Marcus's expression grew ugly, his practiced charm falling away to reveal the predator beneath. "You sanctimonious bitch. Do you have any idea what you've cost me? $20 million, gone because you couldn't be a good wife and keep your mouth shut." "I was never your wife," June said quietly. "I was your victim, but that ends tonight." Through the broken barn door, they could hear the sound of approaching vehicles, multiple engines, growing louder as they raced up the ranch road. Agent Martinez and her team arriving exactly when they'd promised. Marcus heard them too, and desperation began to replace calculation in his eyes. "This isn't over, June. Even if they lock me up, there are others. People who invested in my operations, who expect a return on their money. They'll come for you." "Let them come," Cass said. "We'll be ready." "You?" Marcus laughed bitterly. "I Small-town rancher against a criminal network that spans half the country. You're out of your depth, Cowboy. Maybe, but I'm not alone. The first FBI vehicle came to a stop outside the barn, its headlights illuminating the smoke and debris from the earlier explosion. Agent Martinez's voice carried clearly through the night air as she coordinated with her team. Federal agents. The building is surrounded. Marcus's shoulders sagged slightly, but his eyes remained defiant. You think you've won something here tonight? This is just one operation, one small part of something much larger. Cut off one head, and 2 more will take its place. Ben will cut off those heads too, June said. For Sarah Mitchell, for Lisa Chun, for Rebecca Torres, for all the women you killed. Sentimental nonsense, Marcus sneered. They were weak. They deserved what happened to them. The words hung in the air like a confession, and June felt something cold and final settle in her chest. This was the man she'd once thought she loved, the man she'd believed would protect her. But he had never been anything more than a predator, and she had been nothing more than prey. Marcus, she said quietly, and something in her tone made both men look at her. There's something I need to tell you. She reached into her own jacket and withdrew a small recording device, its red light blinking steadily. Everything you've said tonight has been recorded. Your confession about the murders, your threats against us, your admission about the criminal network, all of it. Marcus's face went white. You're lying. Agent Martinez gave it to me before we came out here. She said that men like you can't resist bragging about their crimes when they think they're in control. June's smile was cold. She was right. The sound of boots on gravel announced the arrival of the FBI team. Agent Martinez appeared in the doorway, her weapon drawn, flanked by 2 other agents. Marcus Harper, she said formally. You're under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, mail fraud, and violation of federal racketeering statutes. As the agents moved to secure Marcus, he looked back at June with an expression of pure hatred. This won't protect you forever. June, there are people who will save it for your lawyer. Agent Martinez cut him off. You have the right to remain silent. I suggest you use it. They found the marriage certificate in his jacket pocket, along with forged documents relating to 3 other women he'd been researching as potential targets. The certificate itself was a masterpiece of fraud official seals, witness signatures, even a fake marriage license number that would have passed casual inspection. This is how he legitimized the transfers, Agent Martinez explained as she bagged the evidence. Legal marriage, followed by what appeared to be voluntary property transfers, followed by convenient accidents. It was a sophisticated operation. June stared at the certificate, seeing her own signature next to Marcus's in the fading ink. I thought it was real. When I signed it, I thought it meant something. It did mean something, Cass said, putting his arm around her shoulders. It meant that you trusted someone who didn't deserve it. But that doesn't make you responsible for what he did with that trust. As Marcus was led away in handcuffs, he turned back one final time. You think this changes anything? You think you can just go back to playing house on your little ranch? The people I work for don't forget, and they don't forgive. Agent Martinez stepped between Marcus and the couple. The only thing you need to worry about is which federal prison you'll be spending the rest of your life in. The barn fell quiet after the FBI vehicles disappeared down the ranch road, taking Marcus Harper out of their lives forever. Cass and June stood among the wreckage, holding each other in the aftermath of violence, breathing in the scent of smoke and burned wood and the lingering fear that still clung to everything. Is it really over? June asked. Cass looked down at her, seeing the woman who had survived 3 years of abuse, escaped across 3 states, and found the courage to stand up to a killer. The danger might not be completely over, he said honestly, but Marcus Harper will never hurt you again. June nodded, understanding the distinction. There might be other threats in the future, other challenges to face. But the man who had defined her life through fear and violence was gone, and that was enough for now. In the distance, dawn was beginning to touch the peaks of the crazy mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. A new day was coming, and for the first time in years, June felt ready to meet it. The new wedding ring was simple and perfect, a plain gold band that caught the afternoon sunlight as it rested in the small velvet box. Cass held it carefully, his calloused rancher's hands gentle with the delicate circle of metal that represented so much more than just jewelry. Unlike the elaborate diamond that Marcus had used to trap June in a marriage built on lies, this ring spoke of something real and chosen and freely given. "Are you certain about this?" he asked, though he knew the answer from the way she looked at him, from the way she'd been looking at him for the past 6 months as they'd rebuilt their lives together. June smiled, the expression lighting up her face in a way that still took his breath away. "I've never been more certain of anything in my life." It was exactly 1 year since that cold dawn when he'd found her sleeping in his barn, though it felt like both a lifetime and no time at all. The seasons had turned full circle, bringing them through the trials of Marcus's arrest and trial, through the media attention that had briefly made their story national news, through the gradual return to the quiet rhythms of ranch life. Marcus Harper had been sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, convicted on 8 counts of first-degree murder, along with dozens of other charges related to his fraud operation. The criminal network he'd been part of had largely collapsed in the wake of his arrest, though Agent Martinez had warned them that some associates might still pose a future threat. For now, though, they were safe. "The foal is kicking again," June said, placing her hand on Buttercup's swollen side. The mare was due any day now, her pregnancy having progressed smoothly under Dr. Morrison's careful supervision. "I think she's as eager to meet the world as we are to meet her." They stood together in the barn where their story had begun, surrounded by the horses that had brought them together and sustained them through everything that followed. The building had been repaired and improved after Marcus's attack, but it still felt like the heart of the ranch, the place where broken things came to heal. "Mrs. Henley has been cooking for 3 days straight," Cass observed, gesturing toward the house where preparations for their wedding celebration were in full swing. "I think she's determined to feed half the county. She's happy." "They all are." June leaned against the stall door, watching as Thunder's echo nuzzled his pasture mate with gentle affection. "I never expected that. After everything that happened, after all the gossip and speculation, I thought the community would always see me as the woman who brought trouble to their door. Instead, they see you as the woman who helped bring down a killer," Cass replied. "Agent Martinez says your testimony was instrumental in convicting Marcus and exposing his entire operation. You saved lives, June." The trial had been difficult, requiring June to relive the worst moments of her marriage in front of judges, juries, and media representatives from across the country. But she'd done it with a quiet dignity that had impressed everyone involved, speaking clearly about the abuse she'd suffered and the crimes she'd witnessed. Her courage had inspired other victims to come forward, helping the FBI build cases against Marcus's associates and bringing closure to families who had lost loved ones to his schemes. "Sheriff Patterson stopped by this morning," June said. "He wanted to personally apologize again for not seeing through Marcus's story when his men first came looking for me. Ben's a good man. He was following proper procedure. I know. But I think he feels responsible for not protecting me better." June's expression grew thoughtful. "It's strange how many people feel like they should have done more, should have seen the signs, should have acted differently. But none of this was their fault. It was Marcus's fault, and his alone." It had taken months of therapy for June to fully accept that truth, to stop blaming herself for the choices her abuser had made. Dr. Sarah Chon, no relation to Marcus's victim, Lisa had helped both of them work through the trauma of their experiences, teaching them how to build a healthy relationship on a foundation of trust rather than fear. "Are you ready?" Cass asked, offering her his arm as they walked toward the house where their guests were gathering. The wedding ceremony was small and intimate, held on the front porch of the ranch house, where June had recovered from her injuries and learned to trust again. Pastor Williams from the Copper Ridge Community Church officiated, reading from a service that emphasized partnership and mutual support rather than traditional vows of obedience. June wore a simple white dress that Mrs. Henley had helped her choose, her hair adorned with wildflowers from the ranch's pastures. Cass wore his best suit, the same one he'd worn to business meetings and cattle auctions. But today it felt transformed by the occasion into something special and ceremonial. When the time came to exchange rings, June removed the thin gold band that had represented her bondage to Marcus and handed it to Dr. Morrison, who would later melt it down and use the gold for a memorial plaque honoring Marcus's victims. In its place, Cass slipped the new ring onto her finger, a ring that represented choice and freedom and a future built together. "I promise to be your partner in all things," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the assembled guests. 2. Stand beside you in good times and bad, to support your dreams as you support mine, and to love you with honesty and courage for all the days of our lives. "I promise to be your sanctuary when the world is harsh," Cass replied, "your strength when you feel weak, and your home wherever life may lead us. I promise to love you not despite your past, but including it because it made you the remarkable woman you are today." The celebration that followed was everything June had never known she wanted, filled with laughter and music in the warm presence of people who had chosen to make them part of their community. Dr. Morrison gave a toast about the healing power of love. Agent Martinez, who had driven up from Denver for the occasion, spoke about courage in the face of adversity. Even Tom, the usually taciturn ranch foreman, raised his glass and declared that the boss had finally found someone worthy of the Rourke name. As the sun set over the crazy mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Cass and June walked hand in hand toward the barn, where Buttercup was showing signs of impending labor. The mare had chosen this day, of all days, to bring new life into the world. "It's fitting," June said as they watched the first contractions begin. "A new beginning on our wedding day." "Everything about us has been about new beginnings," Cass replied, his arm around her waist as they settled in to wait for the foal's arrival. The birth was swift and uncomplicated, supervised by Dr. Morrison and assisted by June's experienced hands. When the filly finally stood on unsteady legs and took her first tentative steps, she was the image of her mother, but with the promise of her father's strength and spirit. "What should we call her?" Cass asked, watching the foal nuzzle against Buttercup's side. June considered for a moment, thinking of everything that had brought them to this moment, the fear and pain of the past, the courage it had taken to trust again, the love that had grown between them like something wild and strong and beautiful. "Hope," she said finally. "Her name is Hope." As dawn broke over the ranch the next morning, Cass woke to find June already at the window, watching the sun rise over land that was now legally theirs together. The mineral rights that Marcus had fraudulently claimed had been returned to the Rourke ranch, but more importantly, the shadow of violence and fear that had hung over their happiness was finally lifted. "Good morning, Mrs. Rourke," he said, coming to stand behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist. "Good morning, husband," she replied, leaning back against his chest. "Ready for whatever today brings?" He kissed the top of her head, breathing in the scent of her hair and the promise of the new day. "With you? I'm ready for anything." Outside, Hope galloped across the pasture on legs that grew stronger with each stride, following her mother toward whatever adventures awaited them. And in the warm kitchen of the ranch house, two people who had found their way to each other through darkness and fear and the simple act of kindness began another day of the life they had chosen to build together, The circle was complete. Healing was real. And the future stretched out before them like an endless Montana sky, vast with possibility and bright with hope.